Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with another channel map, this time for the month of July in the year 2020. We're going to be recapping June real quick, and then we'll go into the plans for this month. I don't expect that this one will be very long, unlike the 30-minute rambling one that I gave you guys last month. So, it is the 3rd of July, which is epic, of course, because of 3. And so far, things have been going pretty well. The month of June in general, I would say, was a pretty good success. And my general takeaways from the month are that we've been able to experience pretty good growth as a community, not in terms of like number of people involved, although somewhat, but mostly like I feel like most people are getting better at playing Starcraft, at playing Hydra, and at making content for Hydra. And that's sort of the individual growth on an individual level, developing tools for Hydra as well. Obviously, Veek's been working on the Python modding suite, and him and I have also been practicing with Rust. And of course, Psycore is always there. DF's always there. You got all these people who are hanging out there, working on stuff. You got, Dark Metzin over there. Can't believe I have to call him that. Working on custom maps and whatnot. And then the number of people like Balethal, Alexander, and briefly myself, obviously also Veek, working on melee maps and offering us more content to experience, to play during our fraud nights and fraud mornings. And that has really been a heavy focus, so much so that we're actually doing it twice a week where possible. It's not something that I necessarily thought would happen, but that actually seems like quite the sustainable approach, even when my schedule returns, as it is about to working 4 days a week. At least that's the current assumption. Now, that may actually change. It really depends on how the next couple of days go. But I am going to go out on a limb and assume that we're dealing with a situation where we're having some pretty heavy amounts of work. So that means that some video content will slow to a crawl, as if it wasn't already. And generally speaking, we'll be focusing on keeping certain things consistent, but I'll get into that more in a little while. Our streak is not yet broken, which is epic. I don't even know how many days it is now, but we're probably, heading up towards 250 if we're not already there. And that's pretty awesome. But I also want to try to, commit to at least one sort of fraud event a week, but ideally two. Like I said, fraud nights on Saturdays have been, it's more like a fraud afternoon for me, but it's fraud nights for all the Euros, and then fraud mornings, which is more like a fraud afternoon for the Euros, on Wednesdays. That's been the setup that we've been doing. I would like to make that very consistent where possible. Obviously, tomorrow, the 4th of July, is a holiday. I probably won't be back in time to do something like that, but if I am, then maybe we will. It'll just be a little bit later. And who's there can participate. Otherwise, it's really just about working around stuff like that comes out of nowhere, basically, or stuff like, holidays that are more extenuating circumstances. And honestly, Hydra's in a decent enough spot that barring any more random A's corruptions that we experienced towards the tail end of the month of June, we shouldn't have any significant issues, just always having a somewhat stable version to play. Still some nefarious, hard to replicate crashes, and we did nail down two of the desyncs, one of which is just still being researched, but the other of which it should be completely resolved. And that is a big deal, obviously. So that means that the game's only getting more stable, the project's only getting more stable. Obviously, we're adding more features as well, which threatens the stability in some cases, depending on how exhaustive and extensive those modifications are to the code base, but generally results in a more interesting end result. Still a ways off from having a product that you can invest yourself into, develop strategies for, and not be threatened to have to relearn a lot of things, because we're adding new units and new upgrades and all this other stuff all the time. And as I've started to grow a little fond of saying, we're not even a third of the way done implementing all of the changes to the game that will come in the form of all of the new units and mechanics and whatnot. So wrap your head around that. We're not even 1/3, because 3 of the way done, and we already have what we have. So it's going to be a mammoth project by the end of it, and it's going to need some pretty significant upgrades to the engine. And with Hydra taking up a lot of my time now, I've actually started to work on learning Rust and C++ and programming more broadly speaking. And I've been starting to learn translating, functions and stuff from the IDA that we're using that translates assembly into C code, but also just straight up through like ASM into Rust or ASM into C++. So I'm learning that reverse engineering process, and while it is silly that we have to do it at all, it's a valuable skill in this context, and I think it's a nice way for me to learn programming in an environment where I'm actually invested in the outcome. So I want to learn how to do it well. And at the same time, I'm encouraged to learn how to do it now, even if that method isn't great and isn't the final method I'll be using and isn't the best way to conceptualize programming or the best design practice. Odds are it's probably not going to be, because I'm a little dumb right now with programming. I'm still learning. But that's been a nice revelation throughout the month of June. I've really appreciated the opportunity for people like iQuare and Veek and Balethal to hop on in the streams and help educate me in that regard and improve my understanding. And it's one of those things that, like, if I was by myself, I would have a much harder time doing it. I probably still would. Like, I'm fairly confident that I still would, even if there was nobody else here to help me. But it would be so much longer of a process, such a much longer road to get to where I'm going. And so I really do appreciate the communal support there and communal help in that particular respect. And so shout out to all you guys, I guess. Appreciate it. Outside of the Rust development and the Fraud Nights and Fraud Mornings, obviously I did allude to the fact that we've been modifying the new game state, the Hydra mod. There's been a lot of development in that, and of course a lot of balancing in that. And I've been trying to be open-minded, a little bit more so lately, but in general, for people's concerns with the balance. But I'm also keenly aware that my vision for what Hydra will eventually become, assuming we stick to my vision, of course, is nowhere really close to being implemented or fully realized. Like I said, we're not even a third of the way there. We're not even 33% of the way done implementing all of the changes. We've got a lot of the superficial stuff down as far as, trying to encapsulate better concepts for the units and better thematics and power fantasies for individual compositions and stuff. For example, I believe in the month of June was when we implemented the Dark Archon mind control changes, which were massive in improving how that unit feels to play, having done so to grief Muta's Dozen over in one of the Fraud Nights recently. It's actually quite a fun unit to use, and there's reasons to use them. And of course, I'm pretty terrible at using them right now because, for one, they were changed, and for another, it's something I never had a lot of practice in, given the fact that they're so niche in the vanilla game. But it's one of those things that really does feel like, wow, this is a straight up improvement over the original unit identity. So I'm really happy with how that turned out in particular. But we've got superficial things like that really do go a long way to improving how players conceptualize compositions and the overhead of using APM on certain units and the actions that they can get from it and the counterplay therein, and all of these other like little puzzles that end up showing up there. Like, if he does this, then what can I do in response? And having all of these deep, interesting settings or scenarios where you basically have there's some brute force things that you can do if you're really good at micro, and then there's just some brute force the other way if you're really good at macro. And of course, then there's straddling the line in a bit more of a strategic sense that you can end up doing. And yeah, I'm very appreciative in that respect of the fact that we've been able to improve the general experience of the game. And obviously lately I've been revising a lot of the unit concepts for stuff that's not completely implemented yet. Stuff like the Gorgoleth and the Paladin and the Kasan Screamer, which is now called something unpronounceable that I still have to remember. Thor or something, I don't fucking know. But I'm revising all of these concepts and trying to make them a little bit like apply the lessons that I've learned by constantly balancing the game state in its current state and applying those to those units that seeing where maybe my initial concepts of a unit were too flawed. If you think back to the initial implementation of the Shaman, which now seems to be in a very, very solid position, we're stuck in a situation where, we were stuck in a situation where the Shaman seemed like it was very powerful, but required a lot of learning and also a decent amount of APM and energy management. So it was like a lot of action economy had to be dedicated to that unit. And its cost was way overdriven, and its vulnerability did not help that either. So there's a very high risk and high APM sync in order to get cost efficiency out of the unit. And that made it a bad investment for most players, and probably for all players, generally speaking, because medics did a superior job in that respect because they were a lot more fire and forget. And players were already familiar with them. So there's a lot of things that were working against the Shaman. Some of it was, sort of circumstantial, like, oh, it's a new unit, so people aren't going to know how to use it. But a lot of it was also down to the concept itself, and we were able to iterate many, many times until we got to a position where it felt really good. And you contrast that with something like the Basilisk or the Hierophant. And these units haven't seen massive changes down the years. They haven't seen significant modifications to their combat roles or anything like that. They've stayed relatively similar. There's been cost changes, mostly making them a little bit more accessible cost-wise. And there's been circumstantial things like improving the rate at which you can access the warp anchor structure for building the Hierophant itself. So there's been balance changes around the accessibility of the unit, either through cost or time or whatever. But not really many direct balance changes to the unit itself. I think I slightly improved the collision of the Hierophant, for example, and also provided it with a bit more of an aggro range so that it was a little bit less retarded when trying to attack units. But aside that, there's been a lot of really solid concepts down the last year or so that I've come up with, I think, that have demonstrated themselves to be rather robust and that stand up now without needing to have been changed on a fundamental level, which obviously contrasts the Cyprian's original incarnation, which was definitely missing the boat there. And of course, the Shaman, as I just mentioned. And I think that the original concept for the Gorgoleth and for the Paladin and for indeed the Kassan Screamer as well, they kind of also missed the boat. They were too macro or micro intensive, but also too demanding of your macro, of your economy. And as a result, they mandated a certain amount of overt risk that simply wasn't justified by what you could realistically get out of them. And, that was probably partially the result of me not realizing how important it was to get good at StarCraft in order, or at least understand what it means to be good at StarCraft before you start messing around with units that, really arcane, high concept units that require a lot of understanding in order to realize how they are. I don't think that the units need to be simple, but I do think that there's a certain point where you dip into a concept that's too arcane to really understand. And in such cases, when it's too arcane to easily understand, I should say, that's when you have to make the unit either a little bit simpler, a little bit more obvious or readable or identifiable, but also potentially you could go the other way and decide, okay, it's going to be arcane, but maybe it's going to be very powerful and require a decent amount of APM, but also be expensive and provide something like that. So I think that could be one of those things. Is there's many ways, many levers to pull in order to balance a unit like what I guess what the Kassan Screamer will end up being, or what the Paladin is right now in its updated, revised state. And I've also started to give a bit more thought into the development of new units and new add-ons and new structures and new mechanics, because we are closing in on updates to the engine of StarCraft that will allow us to have extended data arrays, which is a long time coming. And I've been working pretty heavily on that lately with my Rust education, and that's one of the things that we just about got done by the end of June. So we're almost there already, and it's not even the first week of July over yet. So pretty happy with that. And I guess otherwise, the only Hydra-related thing that happened in the month of June was I developed a little bit of Protoss 02. It's coming along quite well, and I'm assuming that once things calm down here a little bit after the holiday that is about to be upon us, I should be able to get that finished by the end of maybe the second week of July. In theory, the layout will definitely be done by then, but maybe even some AI. I talked about wanting to make some custom AI for individual missions and obviously for individual personalities, more broadly speaking. I haven't really tapped into that pipeline yet, but I did start to with my MapCrep submission, which unfortunately was a flop, because I simply didn't have enough time. I didn't make enough time. And I'm fine with that because I also focused on some more important things like, A's development and stuff like that. But generally speaking, it was a bit of a mistake. I even recorded a whole DADCO on that. So fine, that happens. But ultimately, Protoss 02 will probably be the first real test of my pipeline, I think. And I look forward to getting into that once we have a little bit more organizational stuff taken care of, which pretty much brings me to I would have segued perfectly into the plans that I have for this month. But I did forget to mention that I, of course, did Zerg Expansion, the StarCraft Custom Campaign playthrough. I finished that playthrough in the month of June and unceremoniously stopped uploading campaign playthrough content. I did a couple of castovers for AI stuff, and I intend to do more of those actually relatively soon. But for the time being, that'll probably be the only StarCraft content you see from me, except for a special series that I will get into towards the end of this video, which I promise is coming soon. Like I said, I'm promising a much more condensed one than the 30-minute romp, so hopefully it's only 20 minutes. Engine updates are the main focus of our plans in the next interim, but I've also been working on organizational stuff related to Hydra, the task sheet, and the which is like an internal document for the contributors, but also the new game state documentation is updated, and it has superior formatting, provides you with a lot more of an understanding of what's implemented and what still needs to be done, and sort of the task sheet at least goes over like a relatively reasonable priority list as well. And so that's by no means exhaustive, but definitely something that I'm going to continue to update. And now that we have a framework for it, it seems reasonable to go ahead and pop it in. Now, that being said, I've also been a bit more steeled with Rust and C++ and programming, and I'm now going to continue developing these hooks that will allow us to get better functionality. Recently, I finished the Flingy extender hooks. They are not audited by iQuare. He will be the one to have the final say on whether or not it seems good. And of course, then there's going to need to be a lot of exhaustive testing to make sure that they work correctly. I don't remember exactly how far they will extend in terms of the limit of Flingy entries, but it should be sufficiently high that we never run into it, is my hope. And maybe even if we, in theory, could run into it, it will hopefully be very, very difficult to. And that is where I want all of the different data arrays to go. I want them all to be like some absurd number, like 6,000 entries or something, being the cap. And obviously, I would like them to be even higher than that, because who knows what ends up happening. But in theory, we should be able to handle that. And really, at that point, it'll start to become a bit more of an issue with the modding tools, actually. We'll need to start updating the like PyDat and that sort of thing in order to properly get them, get those entries in. And of course, we'll also need to figure out how to get Firegraph to set up those. I have a feeling we'll probably need to use some other external tool for the extended unit entries at the very least. But time will tell. Time will tell. You never really know with this sort of thing. It's just one of those things that we're definitely going to get a lot of R&D done, research and development, especially the development part. But of course, research is important. So data extenders are going to be the top of our priority list for now. Obviously, other than that, it's organizational stuff for Hydra. It's modern AI development for Hydra. Specifically, like I said, I want to work on development of the second Protoss mission. I also want to develop the second Zerg mission. Now that we have the space ramps from DF, shout out to him. We are going to definitely be working on that mission as well. So I don't know which one will take precedence now, but we'll see what I'm in the mood for mostly when I'm not in the middle of working on all of the programming stuff and the other stuff that I mentioned already. And of course, before we even really get into AI development for the campaign missions, we need to get into AI development for the campaign personalities, which means we need to develop AI that work as like Raynor personality, Dagoth personality, so on and so forth. So time will tell when that ends up getting finalized. But of course, we have a nice roster of characters to work from for now that I can just pick and choose whatever I'm in the mood for and start working on it. So I am looking forward to getting started on that. And I know I said this last month and probably sometime in the middle of May, like 2 months ago, but I really do think that it will start to happen this month, now that I pretty much have done everything else that got in the way and got served as a reasonable excuse at the time. There's no reasonable excuse now beyond once the data extenders are taken care of, which in theory won't be that far out. So, and one can hope. And then rounding us out, Brood War style, graphic conversions once again. I did actually do a couple of these from Atomic Punk towards the end of the month. Check out Start.net's DLDB if you want them from there. Otherwise, at some point I'll throw them on my mega repo probably, but I definitely should look into finding some better way to host them than there. We will see. I said the same thing, I think, in the previous channel map. I definitely want a better way to host those, so we'll see what happens. For video plans, I've got I still haven't done any CSGO map analyses in the past month. I don't know that I will return to it anytime soon, but it is on the list as very occasional, so maybe. And the big thing is I want to work on some more campaign playthroughs, starting with the Vanilla and Brood War campaigns once again. I released a dad called Another Starcraft playthrough that explained this. It's one of those things that I definitely think actually has a surprising amount of educational value. As somebody who is looking to get their own RTS made at some point, particularly the opening of each campaign teaches us a lot about what Blizzard's priorities were and what they thought was acceptable. And while it's easy to call them out for being bad, especially in the modern day, in some cases it is a product of its time. At the same, by the same token, we definitely need to assess qualitatively and objectively. And I do intend to do that. There's going to be a lot of educational value to be had by going through and playing those projects, because those are products as well as projects, and those were sold for money. And so, the commercial work involves a lot of different expectations. And also, considering the game is hailed as pretty much the best RTS there is, bar none, it's one of those things that I think it deserves a whole video series taking down the idea that the campaign is part of what makes the game the best RTS, because it definitely is not a big part of that. So we're going to talk about that, and I hope you'll enjoy that production. At some point after Vanilla and Brood War are done, which I don't think will be done by the end of this month, that might not even be done by the end of this year, depending on how effectively time constrained I am by work and other things. I would like to follow up the playthrough of Vanilla and Brood War with a playthrough of my own campaign in Consummate. I'm floating the idea of maybe doing Hydra, but honestly, the 1.0 version of Hydra, that is. But I honestly don't think that there's much value in looking at that. I may still do it in a more off the cuff manner, maybe not really looking into it as educationally, but that would kind of defeat the purpose of doing them at all. So time will tell. And that basically brings us to an end here for this channel map. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it informative. Try to be a little bit more concise. Of course, went on a rambling rant halfway through and destroyed that idea, but it was a nice idea, and it's the thought that counts. So I will catch you guys in the next video. Stay tuned for more streams. Enjoy the content that's coming. Join us for Fraud Nights and Fraud Mornings. Make some custom maps or melee maps or whatever. Join Mapcrap. Do all these things, man. Do all these things. We need you. We want you. We want to give you smooches. And, nobody can turn down smooches. Bye.